Welcome to Walnut Grove. My name is Lutz Wright, and I'm one of the tour guides here. This house has been standing since 1765, so over 250 years of history, older than America herself. Throughout this channel, me and our other tour guides will take you through the rich history that is documented about Spartanburg County. The history itself is what makes this place interesting, but the lore is what makes it exciting. Charles Moore was born in Northern Ireland and later immigrated to one of the northern colonies. The Spartanburg Historical Association believes it to be Pennsylvania. However, there is no record of Charles Moore until 1752 in Anson County, North Carolina, near what is now Charlotte. That same year, he married his wife Mary, whose family lived in the area. Charles and Mary Moore had 8 children in North Carolina, the eldest being Margaret Catherine Moore, better known as Kate today. 2 years after Charles Moore moved to North Carolina, the French and Indian War broke out between the French and British empires. Native American tribes sided with both empires. In 1763, the Treaty of Paris was signed, ending the war. The Cherokee and British signed a separate peace treaty in 1761 in what is now Kingsport, Tennessee. That treaty established the Cherokee land back to the Blue Ridge Mountains. The treaty also established the Proclamation Line, a line that separated Cherokee and colonist settlements at the Blue Ridge Mountains. Because the Cherokee Indians were pushed back to the Blue Ridge Mountains, the area known as the backcountry of South Carolina was unsettled. To establish a buffer zone between the Blue Ridge Mountains and the rest of the colony, the royal governor, with orders from King George III, offered land to anyone who would settle in the area. Charles Moore took a chance and moved his family down to the unsettled backcountry, what is now Spartanburg County. He ended up receiving a total of 3,600 acres through land grants and one purchase. Around 1765, the manor house was built and the family moved in. After initial construction, the house was a one-room, one-story log cabin with a dormitory-style loft later being added. They would also have 2 more children in Spartanburg County, for a total of 10 children. Just like in the rest of the 13 colonies, when the Revolutionary War broke out, the colonies were divided between Loyalist and Patriot support. Nowhere was the divide so bitter and tense than in the South Carolina backcountry. It was really the precursor to the brother versus brother notion we get with the Civil War. People were tarred and feathered and even hung because they supported one side or the other. The outbreak of the war also gave people an excuse to take revenge for wrongdoings that happened years prior. Now, many of you may have seen the movie The Patriot, and although that movie is loosely, and I emphasize the word loosely, based on the Revolutionary War in the backcountry of South Carolina, the fighting was not as intense as trapping people in a church and burning it down, like the famous scene in the movie, but it was intense. When Charleston fell in 1780, the skirmishes really began to pick up. There were skirmishes and battles in Spartanburg County, Cedar Springs, Lawson's Fort, and McDowell's Camp, just to name a few. There were 9 total skirmishes in Spartanburg County in 1780 alone. Major William Cunningham, a Loyalist, led a raid throughout South Carolina. His most famous being Hayes Station on November 19, 1781. Legend has it William Cunningham himself came to Walnut Grove in November of that year and murdered 3 men on the property. The most famous member of the family associated with the Revolutionary War may or may not even be a true story. Margaret Catherine Moore Berry, better known as Kate today, is said to be a spy for the Patriots during the war. She and a slave by the name of Henry Cato would supposedly hide supplies in trees, and Kate Berry was even said to have warned her husband and the Spartan regiment about Bannister Tarleton and the British before their arrival at Cowpens. The Kate Berry legend was not told, however, until almost 100 years later in a letter by her grandson. That does not mean she did not have a role in the revolution. She very well could have. However, there is no documentation from the time to prove or disprove the story. Throughout that year and into 1781, before Cornwallis's retreat at Yorktown, we see bloody battles at Kings Mountain and Cowpens, both decisive wins for the Patriots. Thomas Moore, Margaret Catherine's brother, and her husband Andrew Berry both fought at Cowpens. After the war, we get the first ever census in United States history. The 1790 census confirmed that the Moore family did have 9 slaves on the plantation, and that number did grow until the outbreak of the Civil War. These slaves worked in the field, but also performed roles such as ironsmith and kitchen cook. Charles Moore continued farming crops such as flax and corn, while also teaching at Rocky Springs Academy. The children married and moved out. Thomas More built a house in 1786 on a piece of land believed to have been gifted by Charles More. The house became known as Fredonia and unfortunately burnt down in 1977, but before the house was burned, it belonged to A.B. More, the first college-educated doctor in the area, and Thomas J. More, a Confederate soldier. Charles and Mary More both died in 1805, only a few months apart from each other, and the house stayed in the family. Charles More Jr., the youngest son, ran a post office in the house until 1820, when he moved out to Alabama. His son stayed in Spartanburg for a few more years before moving out and becoming the successionist governor of Alabama. The house was then left to a granddaughter, who later renovated it on the dawn of the Civil War, adding the dining and changing rooms. Before the Civil War and after the immediate descendants of the Moore family moved out, the house was owned by a man named Captain Samuel Means, who would be a captain for the Confederacy in the Civil War. His wife, Margaret Anna Moore, better known as Ann Means, was the daughter of Thomas Moore. The house was owned by descendants of Andrew Barrymore and then tenant farmers in later years. Around 1940, in the midst of segregation, the Moore family and the Foster family became friends with one another. Henry and Layla Foster and their family were living in a little house not far from Walnut Grove Plantation. Their place of worship, Harrison Grove Baptist Church, was also near the plantation. The manor house was vacant, so Henry went to the Moores to put in a request to rent the property. The Moores granted Henry's request with a good deal on the rent and a promise Henry would share the produce from the farm he had since it was on the property. In 1961, the Fosters had to move out of the home because Tom Moore Craig donated the property to the Spartanburg County Historical Association. Frank Coleman and James Buchanan then took over the role of renovating the house and adding other historical buildings to the property as to make it look like a 1760s plantation. These buildings included the wheat house, the smokehouse, and an iron forge. Other buildings were also added to give you a sense of everyday life here in the backcountry of South Carolina. One of the buildings is a recreation of Rocky Springs Academy, or the school that the Moore children as well as many children of the community attended. Dr. A.B. Moore's doctor's office, or the first college-educated doctor in Spartanburg County, his office is located here on the property. The Bagwell family also donated us a cabin that we then restored and turned into what a kitchen would have looked like at the time. Since October 1967, or a little over 61 years, we have been offering guided tours of the kitchen, the academy, and the original house. These guided tours also include grounds access, which will give you views of the historic buildings as well as a recreation of A.B. Moore's doctor's office. The family cemetery is also viewable. Members buried here in this family cemetery is Charles and Mary Moore, Thomas, Andrew, Margaret, Catherine, along with their wives, husbands, and children. Many members of the Spartanburg community are also buried here. There's so much history of the plantation in Spartanburg County as a whole. Please follow us on our journey as we uncover more and more stories of the area and how it shapes our community today. Come visit Walnut Grove at 1200 Ox Shoals Road in Roebuck, South Carolina.